People talk a lot about being trauma bonded, but what does that mean? Some people mistakenly think it's when two traumatized people form a bond because they have that shared experience of trauma. And that does happen, but that's not what it means to be trauma bonded. If you were abused or neglected as a kid, you've probably been through the real thing, trauma bonding. And I want to help you make sure that it never happens again. A trauma bond is another name for a dynamic also known as intermittent reinforcement, where one person gives intense affection and approval to the other person and then alternates it with neglect and disapproval and abandonment or even abuse. Now, as you know, I'm not a therapist. I'm someone who learned to heal unhealthy attachments in my own life, and now I teach anyone who wants to learn how I did it. So I have a question for you. Would this kind of emotional, on-off kind of torture, blowing hot and cold, and then really cold to the point of cruelty, would it drive away prospective partners? You would think so, right? This ugly treatment should signal major danger to anyone who actually wanted to be loved. But that's exactly where people traumatized as kids are vulnerable. If that's you, you probably recognize right away what I'm talking about, whether you had a name for it or not. And you've already noticed that when someone treated you like this, loving you, then turning cold and betraying you over and over again, it has this insidious power to hook your mind, to grab onto your heart and keep you obsessed and sad and feeling too messed up to even get out. Have you ever been through this? Now, trauma bonding can, in theory, happen to anyone. In warfare, it's a form of psychological manipulation used on prisoners of war to break them down and get them to abandon their loyalty to their own cause and to their own self-interest and instead become completely dedicated to serving their captors. It's a terrible thing to do to a person because it's playing on deep wiring from infancy. It's a survival tactic to do whatever it takes to stay protected and connected to a parent, even if that parent is abusive, even if they've abandoned us for long periods of time. It's interesting, isn't it, that you can trip that wire in an adult, because in adulthood, clinging to a destructive relationship is purely maladaptive. It reminds me of the way mistreated animals stay loyal to abusive owners. It's like an involuntary reflex, isn't it? So when I was 6, I went to a little roadside attraction once where they had chickens in these wire cages, and you could put a coin in the slot and an electric current would run through the wires and make the chickens dance. That's what it said, dancing chickens. And this little tinny little song would play on this terrible little thing. And the machine was attached to the cage, and I'll never forget this horrible thing that I saw. I thought it was charming at first. Dancing chickens, yay! But then all of a sudden I saw this chicken just like jumping up and down and jumping up and down. And I asked my brother, how did they train the chickens to dance like that? And he explained that it was an electric shock, that they were hurting the chicken and it was hurting to put its feet down and it had nowhere else to put its feet. And I had made this happen to the chicken by putting the dime in the slot, and I couldn't make it stop. And I cried because that poor chicken jumping around in there couldn't get away from it. Now, trauma bonding is like a groove in your psyche that can form in your childhood when a parent, sometimes intentionally, but sometimes for reasons beyond their control, could only give love and attention to you some of the time. And if they're caught up in alcoholism or addiction, it's very common to be super loving and then suddenly they're totally out of it and even rageful and or gone from the house behaving dangerously. And then they sober up and they're sorry, so they try again to make it up to you. Or the extra sorry phase never comes. They don't try to make it up for you. But a kid learns to hang on to every tiny sign that the parent loves them, every little crumb or praise of, or bit of attention. And it very easily does long-lasting damage to a kid's emotions and self-concept. And then when the kid grows up, it shows up as a crazy high tolerance for the same kind of treatment from partners. It shows up as an attraction to unavailable people, in fact, or as love addiction, or as a willingness to stay and even an inability to leave abusive partners. And none of this is fulfilling. None of it is happy. None of it helps us. It's a mental hook, right? It creates a sense of dread about losing the relationship that's completely unrealistic. Losing the relationship logically is the best thing that would happen, but something has been activated in our minds that it's not survivable. We just have to keep taking it at any cost. So except when someone is literally a captive, you could leave, but you don't. There's a compulsion in trauma bonding to keep trying and trying. That if you could just figure out the right words and the right behaviors and the perfect response, you could win the love of this hot and cold person, and the love would get switched on for good. That's the fantasy. Now, some of you watching this will have been through a trauma bond relationship with someone very dominating who did this to you. And some of you will have done this to another person. And it's true, there are people who study these tactics and do them on purpose. But I would guess that 95% of the time, it's not anything planned. It's a dynamic that develops between two people who have been conditioned in the past to have an intense emotional response to abandonment. And sometimes it's that intense response that activates the feeling of being in love or the feeling of attachment. Yes, there could be abuse. And if you're in an abusive relationship, I'm going to tell you flat out to get out of it. But in this video, I'm talking not about abuse per se, but about an unhealthy, unhappy dynamic when one partner isn't reliable or committed or equally into the other. And the result for the other partner is to be hooked. The intense feeling of love and relief that comes rushing in when you're allowed back into the arms of the abandoner. It feels like the greatest love of all time, but it's not. It's not actually love at all. It's a bug in the system, in your conditioned responses. And it makes you hold on for dear life when you feel threatened with being rejected. It feels like love, but it's more like the dance of that chicken in the cage with the electrified wires. It's an involuntary response to a stimulus. In other words, if getting hooked in a trauma bond with someone, blowing hot and cold, has happened to you, it was involuntary. It's not your fault. And I want you to get out of the shame and the self-attack that you've maybe been carrying around all these years and in different relationships. You've been hooked on someone, and all your friends can see this person doesn't treat you well. They tell you to leave. You know they're right, but it feels impossible. Well, here's why I want you to be strong and to open up to learning some strategies to get free. Because for people who had trauma as kids, the more time that we spend living on the emotional crumbs in a trauma bond, the harder it is to change. You'll be driven to try, but you don't want to get good. Like, oh, I'm so good at handling this horrible treatment. And it's weird how we kind of pride ourselves on that sometimes. You want to be bad at it. Be bad at that. Don't tolerate it. You want to give voice to the part of you that still knows that this is not what you were meant for. You were born to be loved. You are designed to thrive when you're safe and accepted and supported, just like when you were a kid. And if you're in a relationship where you don't have those things, then effectively you're blocked from your full development. It's so important for you to heal and change that dynamic, either by getting out of it or no longer contributing to it. Because it takes two to be in a trauma bond. And if you're not literally captive to someone, you're the only one who can change the way you relate to that bond. It's you. You've got to fight your attachment to the idea that somehow the other person will change or someone else will come along to save you. You're going to save you. That's the first thing to understand. The second thing is to address the void in your life that makes the drama and loneliness of a trauma bond seem like something you'd want at all. If that's happening for you, I'd wager that you're also suffering from a lack of connection with other people in your life. Maybe you're ashamed of your relationship and you're hiding, or you're keeping people at arm's length so that they won't judge you. But you need a friend or two. You need people who you can tell, who you can be honest with about what you're going through. Just because you're in a hard relationship doesn't mean you have to leave. Sometimes just being connected with other people reduces the pressure on the relationship, reduces the need that you have for that relationship to be everything for you. Sometimes that's enough to produce a positive change in the dynamic. And this is especially true when two people who love each other and want to be in a relationship are still trauma bonding to some degree by fighting and going through drama too much of the time, and even using those upsets to, trigger the unhappy reunion, the removal of the threat to break up, and the restoration of harmony as a mini kind of trauma bond in itself. A couple could go their whole life kind of doing this, maybe just in a small way or a big way. But if you had trauma as a kid, it's going to create a constant pull backward on your healing progress. It's a constant trigger, reactivating your dysregulation and trauma wounds. So peace is a better goal. If you're in a relationship you want to preserve and you both want peace, you can reduce the drama by drawing a hard line against dramatic statements and threats to the future of the relationship. If you don't threaten abandonment, you don't get the high of the happy reunion. There's a lot of communication that needs to happen instead, and it'll take time. But you can start to strengthen your real bond and not have it be so dependent on adrenaline and endorphins to make it feel real to you. If you're in a relationship where you're genuinely not loved, though, and you're aware the right thing really is to leave, then getting support from friends to make your transition out as quietly and intentionally and as drama-free as possible will help prevent a re-triggering of the trauma bond. Having friends and practicing your connection makes leaving much more doable. Without friends, it's unthinkable, right? Like, where would you go? But with friends, you can envision a life where you're going to be okay. You'll have people to hang out with, maybe a place to stay while you get your life sorted out. A trauma bond is in many ways like a drug addiction, and there will be withdrawal. Strategies for a smooth exit are what I teach in my dating and relationships course, and also how to change your patterns and do the work to be ready for something lasting, for something to actually become real love. And I'll put a link below in the description section to that course if you want to check that out. You can learn to date differently, consciously next time, with clarity and support to not fall into your old pattern and to not get involved with abusive or unavailable people. Healing is possible, and I want you to feel that in your bones because it's true. A better life is possible for you, one where you're safe and you're loved because you deserve it. You are meant for that. Now, there are some telltale signs that early trauma is pushing you toward trauma-driven relationships today. I've listed them on a free download that you can access right here, and I will see you very soon.